A few weeks ago, I made a video on the 4 horsewomen of top lane, a quartet of champions infamous for their ubiquitous presence and dominance regardless of the meta or their current power levels. Their overwhelming carry potential and combination of traits has also spawned an almost unanimous contempt from those who have the displeasure of facing them in combat, not just among top laners but all 5 roles. 2 of the 4 horsewomen were only designated as such following the visual gameplay update, Irelia and Fiora, and having covered the former a while back, I think it's time to go over the other one, who, unlike Irelia, was much more in need of a rework due to once being an extremely forgettable member of the roster. Yet at the same time, after how she turned out, I'm not entirely sure which one was better or worse. Ever since her VGU all the way back in Season 5, she's maintained a double-digit ban rate without fail, on several occasions even reaching 20%, which is alarmingly high. And even when she's in a more mild spot, players still don't enjoy going up against her in light of her very selective form of damage. Let's take a look at one of the most controversial gameplay updates in Fiora's Rework, a retrospective. Before I would say Season 5, champions back then were conceptualized in the same general way. It wasn't until the release of Yasuo and onwards when Riot toyed with more inventive, outlandish designs of their champions. So things are very archetypal and template-based in nature, with groups of classes consisting of the same basic principles, only deviating in small properties rather than full-on gameplay quirks. The archetype most guilty of this was a melee fighter class, which I believe had the highest number of members out of any other. I've gone over this before when discussing Aatrox, Irelia, and Warwick's VGUs, which I recommend you check out after this one, but the sheer quantity of melee attackers that all did pretty much the same thing was actually what I believe began the rework initiative as a whole, in that there were too many champs that all did the same thing with very little practical distinction between them. You could easily replace Shyvana with Tryndamere or Master Yi with Aatrox and your team would be none the wiser to the change in your gameplay. Among them, Fiora suffered the most from a perceived lack of identity. There was nothing she did that let her meaningfully stand out amongst the how many dozens of melee auto-attackers back in the day. Her passive was Duelist, granting increased HP regeneration whenever attacking enemy champions that stacked up to 4 times. Duelists are known for dealing tons of damage and being able to withstand tons of damage, so long as it wasn't all burst. Fiora was no exception. But considering that's all her passive consisted of, it's pretty underwhelming. By all accounts, it's a strictly worse version of Nasus or even Warwick's old passive. We're gonna skip her Q and W and talk about her E next. Burst of Speed was a powerful, albeit short-lasting buff that gave her a huge amount of attack speed and stacking movement speed when successfully damaging enemies. Its cooldown would be shortened or completely refreshed based on champion takedowns and kills respectively. The reason I wanted to go over Fiora's passive and E first is because these 2 abilities fundamentally illustrate the reason why her old rendition was such a failure. When looking at Duelist and Burst of Speed, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Plain stats, right? Duelist just gives you healing when attacking, and Burst of Speed helps you attack faster. Not that they were unusable in a pragmatic sense, but they just granted you advantage by their mere presence. On their own, that wouldn't be an issue, but when looking at the rest of her kit, that's when you'll notice the problem. Fiora's Q was Lunge, a short distance free target dash that automatically strikes the nearest enemy, just like her current Lunge. Unlike her current Lunge, however, she could cast it a second time within 4 seconds, allowing for 2 dashes per use of her Q. Curiously, however, Lunge did not apply on-hit effects like it does now. The implication of Lunge was very simple: dodge enemy strikes while countering back, a commonly exercised attack style in traditional fencing. I always appreciated both variants of Lunge as it demonstrated combat mobility in a more nuanced format compared to your garden variety dash abilities like Blade Surge or Leap Strike dropping you right on top of your opponent. In all honesty, Lunge is the only well thought out ability in Fiora's old kit, which makes total sense why it's also the only one to survive the transition pretty much intact. Continuing with the notion of avoiding enemy attacks and striking back, there was Riposte, which in spite of sharing the same name had a completely different effect back then. Passively, she would gain bonus attack damage, and for its active, she would parry the next basic attack within 1.5 seconds and deal a big chunk of magic damage to whoever set this off. It doesn't take a genius to realize how underwhelming of a defensive ability this is, emphasized by the fact that it gives free combat stats to Fiora. Typically, whenever a champion receives bonus stats, whether free attack speed, attack damage, armor, what have you, outside of their passive, that's an indication that the champion doesn't do enough, and so they have to be compensated through free stats. She wasn't the only one out of the Duelist archetype to have something like this, but just in the sheer fact that she did meant there was a severe lack of capability in her base moveset. Fiora's overarching problem was that despite presumably being the Duelist champion, she was an exceptionally terrible one. If you think about it, all of Fiora's abilities are inferior versions of other Duelist abilities. Burst of Speed afforded her the highest attack and movement speed buff out of any champion, but on top of lasting only 3 seconds, it offered no additional effects. Meanwhile, there were Duelist champs like Master Yi who got bonus AD and on-hit true damage for his basic attacks. Irelia can also proc true damage on hit. Olaf's Vicious Strikes was basically Fiora's passive and E combined. As mentioned before, Riposte had to be the single worst defensive ability in the game. Blocking a single basic attack may come in handy against anyone with on-hit related effects, such as Renekton's W, Garen's Q, and whatnot, but stopping one auto attack while Jax could theoretically block millions of autos with Counter-Strike makes her a pretty lousy ability. Not only that, but she couldn't block spells, exclusively autos. Meanwhile, Nocturne's spell shield, in addition to passively granting bonus attack speed that could double, could neutralize a spell, which often includes the accompanying effects of empowered basic attacks anyway. So for all intents and purposes, Fiora's Riposte was an infinitely worse version of Nocturne's Shroud of Darkness, both the passive and active. Now, Fiora's entire design and fighting style references the sport of fencing. Though I don't claim to be an expert, what I do know is that fencing, like other head-to-head martial arts, entails careful avoidance of your opponent's attacks, either by moving just outside of it or parrying it with your own weapon. And while she did have the means of doing this with her Q and W, most of the time Fiora played like a rushdown fighter, running straight towards you with her gap closes and hacking away at you until you died. There was seldom, if ever, a reason for you to play evasive and get quick hits in. Her passive implied you wanted to continuously attack your opponent. The bonus AD from her W implied you wanted to continuously attack your opponent. The bonus attack speed from her E implied you wanted to continuously attack your opponent. Fiora played almost identically to Jax, Olaf, and Tryndamere. Run straight towards their target and hope they have enough stats to win the fight, perhaps dodging one or two key things at a time. Consequently, she struggled to garner any meaningful player base for the simple reason that so many other champions could do her job better than her. The only saving grace of this was her iconic yet notorious Blade Waltz. The easiest way to describe this ability is that it's Mastery's Alpha Strike but with the power budget of an ultimate. She would render herself completely untargetable and strike random enemy champions 5 times, dealing on-hit effects each time. When landing all 5 attacks on a single target, the damage was extraordinary, capable of dealing well over 2,000 with the right items. When paired in tandem with Ravenous Hydra, there were no shortage of clips of her one-shotting all 5 members of the enemy team if they were stacked together. If you guys remember Aphelios' Infernum ultimate splash damaging everyone, Fiora's Blade Waltz essentially could do the same, but that was also why it was such a terribly designed ability. There was no skill, no way to outplay this, just point and click, attack 5 times for ludicrous damage while being completely unable to attack Fiora yourself. The majority of her kit was just free advantage, with the only quote-unquote skill-expressive attack being the one ability that they actually kept. She had no hard CC, no soft CC even, just damage, lots and lots of damage. But, so did everyone else. I can somewhat understand the intent behind her initial design. They wanted to create someone who is evasive, light on her feet, and can strike hard and fast. It would be uncharacteristic for a duelist with a rapier to have big AoE explosions or stuns in her base kit, nor would it have been a good idea for her to have a strong neutral game, which is why they opted against adding any of those in. However, that severely limited her capabilities, with the only method of recourse being to make her virtually a carbon copy of Tryndamere, Mastery, and whatnot. At that point though, you may as well have played anyone else. The bottom line with her previous iteration was that she just did too little. The juxtaposition between old and new Fiora isn't as pronounced mostly because she didn't have a particularly degenerate playstyle. She was straightforward, too straightforward that players forgot she even existed, and so did Riot. For the first 3 years of her release, Fiora received only one singular balance change, only one. It was clear that her first attempt at creating a duelist was an abject failure, and so they tried again, releasing the newly redesigned version towards the tail end of 2015. I'm gonna go on record to say right now that this was a masterfully executed rework. In concept. I mean it, Fiora's Rework did an exquisite job at capturing the essence of a duelist, a champion whose identity revolves around excelling in 1v1 fights by dancing around their attacks while getting quick shots in herself. It's a phenomenal VGU. In concept. Underscoring the notion of dancing around her opponent is the new passive Duelist Dance. Visible enemy champions nearby have one of their 4 cardinal directions exposed to the vital. Striking them in that direction deals bonus % max health true damage, in addition to healing her and giving a boost of movement speed for a short time. This new passive tells you everything you need to know about Fiora's new playstyle. Now, instead of charging headfirst to someone with no rhyme or reason in how you go about it, masterful use of Fiora demands calculated positional awareness, movement, and spacing to deal as much effective damage as you can while exposing yourself as little as possible, just like how it is in real fencing. Moreover, considering the directional nature of her passive, that gives her opponent an equal amount of agency in preventing her from striking vitals too, once more just like how it is in real fencing. This passive alone was enough to reimagine the entire experience of fighting Fiora, making for a fairly engaging fight, and I think most top laners can attest to this. Fighting Fiora actually takes a bit of thought instead of 2 meatheads crashing into each other. You can tell if the Fiora player knows what they're doing based on how they play the early levels. They then went on to add an element of expression to all her abilities too, no longer being just free stuff. Lunge has retained most of its basic functions, but now instead of being 2 free dashes, it's 1 dash that can refund tap its cooldown by striking an enemy, allowing for less dashes and short bursts, but more dashes over a long protracted fight, which is conducive for a duelist. Riposte now renders Fiora invulnerable to all hostile effects, not just basic attacks, and does so for a fixed amount of time, letting her block an indeterminate amount of stuff. Now changed to a skill shot, she launches a projectile forward that slows and cripples the first enemy champion in its path, or stuns them if she successfully parries at least 1 hard crowd control. There have been many who complained about the unfairly overpowered risk-reward this ability has, myself included, but at the same time, it does have built-in countermeasures in place. It's no longer just free advantage. That is, unless you're playing someone with reactable hard CC, but in that case you can make the same argument for Nocturne and Sivir spell shields or Yasuo's Wind Wall if it's a projectile. In any case, the new riposte has potentially more reward, but it can also potentially miss, plus it doesn't give free AD anymore. Burst speed was changed to blade work, granting her bonus attack speed just like before, but only on the next 2 hits, each having different properties, although it's mostly giving her the ability to quickly strike more vitals. While technically this is free stuff, the on it slow offered by the first attack and only having the next 2 hits boosted means Fiora has to know when is the best time to use it to get her more vitals, instead of spamming autos on her target at the earliest convenience. Finally, her ultimate grand challenge exposes all 4 vitals on a target of choice and grants a bonus movement speed from her passive while near that person. When striking all 4 vitals, or if the target dies with at least 1 vital down, she creates a massive healing zone that can regenerate herself and her team. One issue I neglected to mention with old Fiora was that she had no teamfight utility whatsoever. Now she does, with her parry and ultimate, but back to the original point, nothing in Fiora's kit is free. Every ability either has a condition that needs to be met to achieve the full effect, or requires precise timing, spacing, and aiming for you to successfully land it, to which her opponent can also do what they can to prevent that from happening. New Fiora was brilliantly conceptualized, making it all the more disappointing to see it all ruined by one singular aspect. Detracting from this otherwise interactive experience is a specific type of damage Fiora deals from striking vitals, percent max health true damage. This right here single-handedly ruined and is still ruining everything about her. I talked about this countless times, but percent max health true damage, objectively, in a vacuum and in context, is just not good for the game, under any circumstance. The mark of how healthy a mechanic is not the quantity, quality, or efficiency, but the means of shutting it down. Champions can be totally fine with billions of damage in their abilities so long as players can build billions of armor and or magic resist. It's all relative. But for percent max health true damage, there is no form of counterplay against it. No amount of health, armor, magic resist, damage reduction, or anything will mitigate how much damage you take. And don't say shields are sustained. That doesn't apply to percent max health true damage any more than it does regular damage. Because Fiora deals percent max health true damage, she naturally out DPSs every other champion in the game. And while this is somewhat accurate to her never having lost a duel before, in-game that translates to beating virtually everyone else. What makes things worse is that unlike other forms of true damage, hers actually increases based on bonus attack damage, something she was planning on building anyway. So not only does her normal damage increase, but her percent health true damage does too, causing her to eventually deal more true damage than physical, and with it being percent health, even frontline champions will melt after a few strikes. Once her true damage reaches the 12 to 15 percentile, she goes from being a duelist to an assassin thanks to shredding more than half her HP right from the start. What makes her feel so oppressive is not the things that she can do, but the fact that you can't do anything about it. People complain about how egregious riposte is because, due to percent max health true damage rendering any defensive measures like armor, health, or spells like exhaust basically ineffective, the only way to stop her is hard crowd control. Thing is, she has a way to not only prevent you from CCing her, but CC you right back, and a 2-second stun is more than enough time for her to strike all 4 vitals, guaranteeing that you have no chance of winning the fight. Fiora's passive also made her one of the biggest beneficiaries of the damage power creep we've been experiencing for the past 8 years. At the very start of her rework, she used to require like 4 damage items before her vitals became a problem. Now she can start one-shotting people with just 2. That's why she's so unpleasant to fight. Knowing there's nothing you can do to stop her damage from spiraling out of control other than being ridiculously far ahead of her and killing her faster is extremely frustrating, and even then, she can probably still 1v1 you while being down a full item because that's just how overpowered max out true damage is. She's a very interactive champion to play against, but towards the mid to late game it becomes less and less interactive as ironically she regresses back to being old Fiora where she charges headfirst at you with a superior damage output, mashing her face on the keyboard while there's nothing you can do about it. It's the Akali situation all over again. Fantastic concept, all ruined by giving her too much privilege. Okay, I'm gonna stop here before I start getting angry talking about her. The long and short of it is, if they changed Fiora's passive to do percent physical damage instead of true and bounced accordingly, she would actually have counterplay and be significantly less hated. I like the whole idea of striking vitals from different directions, but the payoff is just too overwhelmingly skewed in her favor. At the very least, someone like Vayne has to attack 3 times to proc silver bolts, and the scaling is fixed. Fiora's ultimate lets her instantly proc duelist dance 4 times. Let me know your thoughts on Fiora's rework in the comments down below if you agree or disagree with my stance on it, but apart from that, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other rework retrospectives if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.